Yeah, so what's actually happened? I mean, Ukraine already had the ATACMS, but what's happened is that now we've gotten confirmation of approval from President Joe Biden to actually use these ATACMS to shoot into Russian territory. So that's what's changed, that before Ukraine was explicitly instructed not to use these long-range missiles to shoot into Russian territory. Now, what we're hearing is that most likely the US is only approving using these long-range missiles to shoot into the area of Kursk, where Ukraine has captured some Russian territory. So they're certainly not saying like, okay, you can now shoot at Moscow or, any part of Russia is free game. So I don't see this as a game changer for Ukraine. Ukraine has been asking for this permission for a long time, and it may give Ukraine a little bit more leverage vis-a-vis Russia, because Russia now might be a little more concerned about where Ukraine would feel confident to shoot these missiles into Russian territory. But this isn't going to mean that Ukraine can now suddenly take back all of their territory that's been occupied by Russia or fundamentally shift the course or the outcome of the war. It more means that Ukraine might have a little bit more leverage if it is essentially forced into some kind of political negotiation next year once President Trump takes power.
And do you think that political negotiation would involve, the territory that Ukraine has taken in Kursk and also the annexation of Crimea?
Yeah, definitely. I think both of those things are going to be very much on the table, and they're going to be very sort of contentious and tricky issues. So the territory that Ukraine has captured in Kursk, I actually saw this primarily, this just happened in the last few months, and it's relatively sparsely populated territory. It's not very strategically important territory, but it's symbolic. So the fact that Ukraine for the first time is capturing territory inside Russia is definitely symbolic. And I saw this primarily as Ukraine understanding that within, at most the next year, it probably would have to negotiate a political settlement, and that capturing some Russian territory will give it a very strong bargaining chip in those eventual expected negotiations. So that's where I see Kursk coming in. In terms of Crimea, Crimea is a really tricky issue, and I think that whilst Ukrainians had said ever since Russia's full-scale invasion, let's just remember, first of all, that Crimea was captured way back in 2014. But ever since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukrainians have been saying that they want Crimea back as well, that they would not compromise on getting back Crimea. However, where Ukraine is situated at the moment, which is that Russia not only has Crimea, but has also captured a fair amount, up to sort of 20% of Ukraine's territory at the moment. And it doesn't look like Ukraine really has significant ability to push them back. And with a Trump presidency coming in, that ability may even decrease. So I think where we're sitting at the moment, Crimea will probably not be on the table to go back to Ukraine in any kind of eventual political settlement. I mean, I'm saying that knowing that a lot of Ukrainians would not be happy with that statement and would fundamentally disagree with it. But I think realistically, that's probably what we're looking at the moment.
Yeah, given that Joe Biden has about a month and a half in his presidency, and perhaps expecting what Donald Trump might do, and which is to negotiate first. Do we expect more from the Biden administration in terms of more announcements, such as the one he made today?
I don't think that we'll see a lot more. We might see a few more relatively sort of cautious incremental steps of allowing Ukraine, for example, to shoot a little bit further or to strike a little bit further into Russian territory. But even with this announcement, it was really saying that Ukraine could use military capability that they already have in order to cover territory that they've already captured inside Russia. So it wasn't sort of as radical or as dramatic as maybe it seems. And I think that's because President Joe Biden, whilst he will want to take a few steps to bolster support for Ukraine before he leaves office, he's also aware that he doesn't want to reach that tipping point with President Putin that no one quite knows where it is, and it certainly hasn't come yet, where, Ukraine sort of crosses some kind of unknown red line for Putin and then provokes a much more escalatory reaction.
Yeah, speaking of tipping point, we've had a Russian lawmaker, Vladimir Zaborov, saying that this is a big step towards World War III. So can we expect an escalation, or are these just empty threats?
I don't think that we will see any kind of significant escalation on behalf of President Putin as a result of this announcement. And that's because it's really not that radical when you look at what Ukraine will be able to do, in that essentially they'll be able to, strike deeper across the territory of Kursk. Although, having said that, it is significant and it is very important for Ukraine that they've gained this approval. But I don't think we'll see any specific escalatory response from President Putin, just because Putin knows that he's actually in quite a weak position by now. He's been fighting this war for a long time. There've been, by any estimate, hundreds of thousands of Russian casualties. Russians, whilst they may not be rising up against the war and not going to do that anytime soon, they're certainly tired of the war and would like it to end. They don't want to see an escalation of the conflict that's currently ongoing. So I don't think that we will see any kind of more extreme reaction at this stage.
And given a lot of focus on Kursk at the moment, how complicated would the fact that there are thousands of North Korean troops that are being deployed there, how complicated does this get then for the Kremlin and the White House?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And in some ways, I think that Joe Biden's move was in response to the fact that by any estimate, about maybe 10,000 North Korean troops seem to be now stationed in Kursk. And if they haven't entered the fighting, they're certainly willing and able and ready to enter the fighting. And so I think partly also this was the US president signaling to North Korea and to any other country who might be contemplating joining Russia in their war that there will be consequences. So if Ukraine now has more ease of ability to strike those troops who are fighting in Kursk, and by all accounts, the North Korean troops will be fighting in Kursk so that they can still remain in principle on what is considered Russian territory. The entry of North Korea into this war is actually really significant. So even though North Korea is a relatively small country, they don't have a lot of power themselves in the international arena, but they are quite closely allied with China. Not saying that China in any way condoned them entering the war, but it does mean that this war now expands formally and officially beyond just Russia and Ukraine, with boots on the ground from another state, not just sending military aid, not just sending weapons, but actually on the ground fighting, on the front lines, essentially side by side with Russian troops. So that's pretty significant and does expand this beyond two countries fighting each other.
Okay, Dr. Jessica Genauer, really good to get your analysis. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on the program.